All right, what's going on, everyone? We're going to dive right in here. A new article just came out on War in the Rocks, and I think this is the best summation as to how the Ukrainian counteroffensive has looked at really the 3-month mark. I'll put a link in the description below if you want to read the article in its entirety. It's pretty long, so I'm just going to go over some of the kind of highlights, key points that really stood out to me. I'll also link where you can find the authors of this piece, Michael Kaufman and Rob Lee. Personal opinion, I think these guys are some of the best analysts out there when it comes to understanding what's going on with this war and how it's playing out. From my perspective, they're very, very deliberate in how they gather information and how they check their sources and what they decide to put out and how they articulate kind of their findings. They're worth a follow, worth checking in on from time to time. So starting out, the authors say that the offensive is gaining momentum. Much remains undecided, but 3 months in, it offers an opportunity to take stock of the operation so far. Adding, quote, progress has been fitful and slower than expected, as acknowledged by President Zelensky and now former Ukrainian Defense Minister Reznikov. However, Ukraine's recent gains illustrate that it has worn down Russian defenses over time, leveraging an advantage in fires, more on that in a second, and long-range precision weapons to steadily press Russian forces back from their defensive positions. That said, Ukraine will need to both break through Russian lines and exploit that success to reach its objectives. Much of that could be decided in the coming weeks. So when talking about Ukrainian fire superiority, that's not been a thing, big picture, throughout the entire war, and it is still not a thing today. What they're talking about here is more of a local fire superiority. So in some of the areas where Ukraine has chosen to kick off this offensive, they likely, it looks like at this point, have a superiority in fires in general and long-range precision fires specifically. So again, this isn't comparing Ukraine's artillery to Russia's artillery. It's comparing the two sides' artillery to a 10 to 20 kilometer portion of the front. They continue saying that Ukraine needs more air defense, mine clearing, and similar enabling capabilities. Western assistance over the past 18 months has enabled Ukraine, but it has also limited Ukraine's options, resulting in undertrained units having to go up against a well-prepared defense without the benefit of air support. They say the Ukrainian military continues to struggle with scaling offensive operations and conducting combined arms operations at the battalion level and above, with most attacks being at the level of platoon or company. And that is something we've seen play out over and over again in this war. They're going to talk about, or especially in the last few months, they're going to talk about some of the early attacks and how those were of a scale large enough to consider them the main effort of this Ukrainian offensive. But after that petered out, really, in the opening days, what we're starting to see more of is what Ukraine is familiar with and what Ukraine is good at. These smaller scale fights facilitated by artillery, facilitated by some of the long-range precision munitions, and then you've got platoons and company size elements with or without armor, in many cases, pushing tree line to tree line. The authors continue, the process of adaptation equally requires identifying what has worked and what has not. The ability to discuss these challenges openly is what separates successful militaries from those like Russia's, which often falsifies successes and buries bad news. Indeed, a poor understanding of how Ukraine's military fights and of the operating environment writ large may be leading to false expectations, misplaced advice, and unfair criticism in Western official circles. Now, there have been a handful of leaks pushed out to the press recently, and they're always from unnamed officials, but it's been instances of saying the Ukrainian offensive is not going as fast as expected or not as successful as expected. And there were some I saw recently where they were suggesting that the reason things aren't going as well as hoped is because Ukraine chose not to listen to U.S. or NATO guidance, which was hoping for, one major thrust through the Russian positions. Whereas, we'll get more into this in a second, Ukraine seems to have chosen multiple axes of attack to try to figure out a weakness in the Russian lines that they could then exploit. It's hard to tell. Is that somebody inside the government just trying to cover their ass? Because that happens all the time, especially with these leaks, right? Things are rarely leaked accidentally. There tends to be some sort of reason for that. Is that a legitimate argument happening at the top levels of government? Are these is this the minority view that has that take? It's really, really hard to understand, but either way, there absolutely have been, over the last few weeks, I would say a slight uptick in kind of Western criticism, if you will, as to how Ukraine is executing this war. Now, continuing on, the authors continue, Ukrainian forces made gains along the flanks of Bakhmut, but the initial advances along the main axis in the south were not as successful as anticipated. In the second week of the overall counteroffensive, Ukraine managed to capture a string of towns running south of Velko-Novosilka, but the progress afterwards there has been slow. What appeared to be the main axis of advance in this offensive, led by the 47th Mechanized Brigade south of Orahiv, also stalled early on. And that's one of the things, again, in my opinion, that gives some credibility to Lee and Kaufman. I've listened to a lot of their podcasts and read a lot of what they've put out there. They're not scared to criticize when criticism is needed, and you're going to see that. They're not going to pull punches from things that Ukraine had, maybe could have done differently in this case. But they're also going to offer some suggestions on how that can be mitigated going forward. So continuing on, they say, much of the fighting inside the towns Ukraine has liberated thus far has been done by more experienced brigades, with the exception of the efforts by the 47th Mechanized Brigade and more recently the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. Saying, indeed, it appears some of the new brigades, these new Western-trained brigades made up of largely mobilized soldiers inside Ukraine, or at least recently signed up soldiers that were trained largely outside of Ukraine, but some training was done inside as well, and then outfitted with Western equipment. That's what they're talking about when they say new brigades. Some of these were moved from, some of these new brigades were used to replace elements from experienced brigades on the Crimea front so they could be used around Bakhmut. So this is one of the criticisms I've heard from, criticism is the right way to say it, from Kaufman and a handful of others recently, is that Ukraine largely went into this counteroffensive leading the charge with inexperienced soldiers. They've got a relatively experienced military at this point. They've been fighting for over a year. They've got a lot of soldiers, units, and leaders that are very well versed in this type of warfare because they've been fighting it for over a year. Yet some of these areas, the main effort kicked off, the main assault force in some cases, with newly organized units. And the question, before that and even now is, how much can you expect from them? It takes so much to get a unit, trained and cohesive, able to operate together. There may have been unrealistic expectations given the resources put into that fight. The authors continue, while there's no way to truly know what the percentage of combat power has been committed at this point of the counteroffensive, most of the Ukrainian brigades expected to be involved, including air assault reserve units, are contributing to the fight in one fashion or another. It's unclear if Ukraine is transferring additional forces from other fronts, though some recent reporting suggests this might be the case. Russia has also deployed strategic reserves, including the 7th Guards Mountain Air Assault Division and 76th Guards Air Assault Division and elements of its Dnieper Task Force in Kherson. Something they're going to get into here is really going to be the focus of where Kaufman and Lee see this fight going, is not a focus on, is on attrition. Attritional warfare. That's back where we are, as opposed to the brief snippets of maneuver warfare that we thought might have been the case at the start of the counteroffensive. So in turn, where and if reserve elements are being committed is going to end up being, potentially a determining factor as to how this whole thing plays out. Now, moving back to some of the early days of the counteroffensive, the authors say the initial attack was not mere reconnaissance or probing, but rather a focused effort to rapidly break through Russia's forward positions. I don't know if you remember when this happened, but when the first major maneuver elements, they go on to say that included Bradley's Leopards, mine-rolling tanks were moving forward. There was a lot of talk, especially after they were stopped, saying this must be just a probing effort. This must just be a reconnaissance in force, trying to find a weak point in the lines. Kaufman and Lee disagree. They say that was it. That was the start of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. That was the main effort, but it was stopped. They say one Ukrainian unit, going into details of that initial assault, one Ukrainian unit ran into problems that forced it to miss the start of the assault by a couple of hours. This meant the unit went into the assault long after the main suppressive artillery barrage had been fired, leaving its assault forces vulnerable to unsuppressed Russian artillery and anti-tank guided missiles. That advance was supposed to occur under the cover of darkness, but instead happened near dawn, negating the advantage provided by their Western armored vehicles' superior night vision capabilities. Another Ukrainian unit mistook the friendly units holding its flank for the initial Russian line, and in the confusion engaged the friendly force. A different grouping became disoriented at night, stacking the formation, which made them more vulnerable to Russian artillery and anti-tank guided missile fire. So again, we're talking about I don't mean to downplay the skill and the training in some of these Ukrainian units, but if you're looking at it on a sliding scale, some of their more experienced units were not those that were involved in this initial fight. And you have to wonder, had those units been some of the more well-trained, more experienced troops from across the Ukrainian armed forces, would it have gone differently? They say that some commentators had assumed, and this is going to ring true to anybody in the online community. You're going to have seen this everywhere on Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, YouTube. Some commentators had assumed the initial assault was not the main effort, and 3 months in, some still characterize the offensive as its early stages. Kaufman and Lee say the initial assault was the breaching effort, but it did not succeed. And I think, again, it's valuable to get into this kind of stuff, because if we kind of mince words and talk about it and present it as something that it wasn't, we're not necessarily gaining the information that we need to gain. They go on saying Western criticism, often appearing in the form of anonymous leaks by officials, sometimes holds that Ukraine won't mass forces and accept an inherent casualties in such an assault. This fails to appreciate the real constraints on that military's capability to employ forces at scale. The United States has been misinterpreting this as a failure to commit forces to the offensive. Ukraine's challenges at scaling how it employs forces cannot be overcome by a few months of training and Western equipment. Ukraine's military excels at mobile and positional defense. It is also highly effective in small unit tactics and in effective employment of fires to degrade the Russian military. I think this gets at kind of the natural challenge in war. And we're going to talk about this more in a second when Kaufman and Lee get into the effects that the F-16s may or may not have had, should they have been available for this counteroffensive. But it's this challenge that Ukraine is up against, where they're trying to defend all across their country. And remember, Russia was still attacking well through the winter months. So it's not like Ukraine had a break in the war and was able to pull out 90% of their forces and start training for this massive military operation. They were still actively engaged in the fight. And every soldier that is sent to Germany or anywhere else to go through training is one less soldier on the front. And Ukraine couldn't risk any sort of, what if Russia decided to kick off some sort of major offensive in January? Ukraine couldn't risk that by pulling the vast majority of their troops off the front. So they really only had a limited amount of time. And I think what Kaufman and Lee are getting at here, and they'll continue to kind of hammer this home, is we've been very focused on trying to get Ukraine to fight a Western way of war. And, that time may have been better suited, and I don't think we have the answers to it yet, as to how we would do this going forward, but it may have been better suited, helping them to fight in a Ukrainian manner, the way that they already are fighting, and maybe positively affecting that with enablers or new equipment or whatever it might be, could have potentially seen success a little bit sooner. I mean, now we are at a point where instead of that maneuver warfare, they're back to the attritional approach that they know and that they're, proving to be pretty good at. On that note, the authors say that after the first week, the operation moved to an attritional phase, not dissimilar to the offensive in Kherson, which was last fall. Ukrainian forces have been degrading the Russian defense with artillery fire, HIMARS, drones, and select strikes with Storm Shadow missiles against high-value targets. Ukraine is also attempting to interdict the flow of Russian supplies from Crimea by striking the connecting bridges and rail stations, including a strike on the Crimean bridge reportedly with naval drones. An intense counter-battery battle has been playing out between Ukrainian and Russian artillery units, with HIMARS increasingly used in a counter-battery role due to improved Ukrainian ability to target behind Russian lines. So when HIMARS first came out, they were primarily engaging static targets. This was rail lines, transportation hubs, command centers, things that they're not going to move, right? So once you get their location, if you fix that location on a Tuesday afternoon, you can wait to fire that thing a couple days, and it's still going to be there. The command post is still going to be there. The supply dump is still going to be there for the most part. Engaging artillery, you have to have very real-time data because you don't want to waste a missile and give away your location to fire on an enemy artillery system that got out of that firing point as soon as the firing mission was complete. So changing the HIMARS to a counter-battery role shows that the real-time targeting capability along the Russian lines has greatly increased over the last year. The authors continue, despite the natural tendency to focus on settlements liberated, the balance of attrition will prove more significant in shaping Ukraine's offensive prospects than anything else. And I think this is a challenge. You hear people constantly, and it's so easy to look at the territory gained or retaken by Ukraine to point to success or failure, and it's the easiest way to do it because we don't have a good number when it comes to the attritional fight. We don't necessarily know how many losses there have been on both sides, and we don't know how easily replaced those are on both sides. But, Kaufman and Lee get into why that, really more than anything else, that's the answer here. It's not 5 kilometers of progress over, is great over one day, is bad over 3 weeks. It's how many Russian and Ukrainian soldiers and pieces of military equipment were exchanged for that 5-kilometer stretch. They say, given Russia's layered defensive lines, minefields, and entrenchments, it was unlikely that the Ukrainian military will be able to attain a breakthrough without first inflicting high levels of attrition on the defending Russian force. Again, this focus on attrition that is, look, there's been crazy casualty estimates coming out of both sides since the very early days of this war. So I know I'm not very confident with any of them, if I'm being honest. There's not one source I can go to and say that one seems the most realistic to me. They're all over the map. And you tend to see those casualty figures used as more of a confirmation bias, if you will. In my opinion, that's just how they tend to be used. If somebody wants to say that Russia is dominating this war, they're going to use casualty figures that show, 500,000 Ukrainian casualties. And if somebody wants to say that Ukraine is winning this war, to back that up, they use a figure that says 300, 400 plus whatever thousand Russian casualties. So either way, I haven't found a good source there that I can go back to time and again that really locks it in. But now getting into what Ukraine has actually experienced as they've pushed into some of these Russian lines, a couple of these I haven't really heard anything about, so it's pretty interesting. One here, the authors say that Russian forces have also adapted with nasty innovations. For example, decoy trenches mined with explosives that can be remotely detonated once they are occupied by Ukrainian soldiers. Russian anti-tank guided missile teams have deployed cameras in front of their positions to identify advancing Ukrainian vehicles and have dug tunnels that can be used to transfer ammunition, equipment, and personnel. I did see a video recently. It wasn't very clear, and there were a lot of arrows pointing that there were some tunnel networks being used to move between Russian trench lines. I didn't share it just because it was so grainy and so hard to see that you could argue that it was just a dugout rather than an actual tunnel. But that will be something to keep an eye on as Ukrainian forces, should they continue to advance and get into some of these Russian trench lines. I'm sure we're going to see videos of tunnels if those tunnels are there. But, decoy trenches, a booby-trap trench, again, brings you back to World War I, doesn't it? The authors continue, Russian forces have deployed more mines than normal in Russian doctrine, according to their field research. Individual Russian company positions generally have minefields with hundreds or thousands of TM-62 anti-tank mines in front of their positions. They've been stacking 3 anti-tank mines on top of one another to specifically destroy and not just damage mine rollers that are being used by breaching vehicles and tanks. These are supplemented by TM-83 explosively formed penetrator anti-tank mines, often placed in tree lines to target tanks and armored vehicles from the side as they drive down the dirt paths that frequently run parallel. So the Russian military doctrine already relies pretty heavily in the defense on substantial minefields. So to hear that the actual use of mines is even more than you would get from Russian doctrine, I think speaks to just how it's insane. Some of the videos coming out of Ukraine, some of the mine clearance operations, it is absolutely insane. And what we're seeing in the south, some of these areas where Ukraine is advancing now, it dwarfs what we saw in previous areas when they've, after Ukraine recaptured areas in Kharkiv and Kherson, and demining units had to go in and start to pull these out. There were mines there, and there were a lot of mines there, but it doesn't look like it's anything compared to what we're seeing in the south. They add that Russian forces are also using Fab 100 and Fab 250 aerial bombs as improved mines. Russia is remotely deploying mines with artillery, mine lane systems, and even drones. These are used to refill lanes cleared by Ukrainian sappers and to mine roads behind Ukraine's front lines. Ukraine mine-clearing vehicles, including those that carry mine-clearing line charges, MICLICs, talked about those a few times, are a priority target for Russian defenders and anti-tank guided missile teams. So again, just the challenge of these mines, I think it's easy to look at a minefield and say you clear a path and the path is good to go. But what they're getting at here is after that path is cleared, and maybe you can't heavily mine it like you could when, from Russia's perspective, while they own that territory or in control of that territory, they had the ability to remotely lay mines over that area. So Ukraine might clear a path to be able to move armored vehicles through or medevac soldiers out of an attack position or an assault position after they've taken casualties assaulting a Russian trench. And then once that area is cleared, Russia can target it with bombs or artillery and reseed it. with more mines. So it's nasty and it's slow going. I mean, no wonder everything's taken so long, right? It's not going to be fast in that sort of environment. The authors say that Russian defenses in the south especially were stronger than expected, stymieing the initial assault, which is different from the fighting in Kherson last year, where secondary lines were well manned while the forward positions folded quickly. In the south, Russian units have densely deployed anti-tank guided missiles all along the forward line. And there is more information starting to come out about this now, and it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out, but there's been some rumors circulating that Russia is spending more time and energy and resources defending the very frontline positions than maybe was initially thought. So when we first looked at this Surovikin line across the south and portions of the east, the idea was kind of a lightly manned first line, and then as you moved back, the maybe the first or second main line of defense was where the majority of Russian troops would be. There'd be some mobile reserves stacked in throughout that could, jump in to plug a gap in the line should that happen. You had artillery units, things like that. But it was widely believed that, a much smaller force was forward, and then they would kind of slow down and trit the Ukrainian forces with mines and artillery and loitering munitions. And then as this, somewhat depleted Ukrainian force moved through that first line, they would hit, the major defensive line. It's starting to sound like that might not be as extreme a difference as we thought, and that Russia may have put a lot more into this first line of defense. Again, something we won't know until, should Ukraine push forward and actually make it through some of those lines, we'll have a better picture on that. And Kaufman and Lee get right into that idea here, saying, Russian forces have chosen to defend forward of the Surovikin line, concentrating their efforts on holding the first line of defense in the towns that anchor it. To be clear, the first line does feature extensive entrenchments, including tunnel networks. The follow-on lines include machine-dug trenches, anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth, and likely more minefields. The Russian decision to defend forward has favored Kyiv because it allowed Ukrainian artillery to attrit the Russian units forward deployed. So again, if this isn't, as we get through this, you're going to see this isn't the authors saying that Ukraine will win or Ukraine is going to win. Simply that if Russia made that decision to push forward more units to try to stop Ukraine at the very first line of defense, that may actually long-term play out in Ukraine's favor, because a lot of those soldiers that would have been outside the, still would have been in HIMARS range and Storm Shadow range, but they would have been outside the range of most, Ukrainian loitering munitions, any direct fire weapon systems, and most artillery platforms. When they move forward to that first line of defense, all of a sudden they're in range of everything, right? So the authors continue, Russia has a sizable force in Ukraine, but the quality varies significantly, and a sizable portion of that force consists of mobilized regiments. In the south, it appears the front line is largely being held by a mix of regular tank and motorized rifle regiments, mobilized units, naval infantry, and Storm Z units, which are manned by convicts. Storm Z units are distributed to motor rifle companies to use as forward deployed expendable infantry, typically among the first line of defenses. Gotta love that line that's kind of come out in this conflict. Expendable infantry sounds awful. Naval infantry and more capable motorized Russian troops hold strong points in towns that are used for counterattacking. And this is a little piece here that I haven't heard much about recently, Spetsnaz. So the Russian Special Forces. They say that in addition, elements from the 22nd and 45th Spetsnaz brigades are reportedly defending the Orikhiv axis. These units appear to be playing a key role in locating targets for artillery strikes and providing a greater anti-armor capability to conventional units with anti-tank missiles and loiter munitions. Early in the war, there was a lot of talk about how some of the more specialized units like Spetsnaz within the Russian military were being used in a leg infantry role. They were just assault troops like everybody else, which likely led to a significant casualty rate in their ranks. And these are some of the highest trained soldiers within the Russian military. It makes sense if they're being used in this capacity, directing airstrikes, coordinating artillery, things like that, kind of adding a specialized capability to existing Russian units. That fits within the Spetsnaz kind of mission set. So interesting to see that, where, the specialized, highly trained Russian soldiers is right where Ukraine is focusing. Kind of talks about, it speaks to how important that axis of attack is. They talk a little bit about Bakhmut, saying that all Wagner forces were reportedly replaced in Bakhmut at the beginning of June, and most of Russia's airborne forces are now deployed to the area, including elements of the 31st, 11th, and 83rd Air Assault Brigades, as well as the 106th and 98th and 98th Airborne Division. So Bakhmut is still a fight very much ongoing. Hasn't been a lot of progress there, all things considered, especially related to the south, but it is still very much an active fight. The authors continue, the challenge with the ongoing battle for Bakhmut is that the opportunity there cannot be exploited without pulling units from Ukraine's southern offensive. Beyond Bakhmut, Russia has better established lines of defense, making a breakout unlikely. At Bakhmut, many of Ukraine's best units are fighting in a supporting offensive, while its newer and less experienced units are on the strategically significant axis in the south. So there were a lot of questions around Bakhmut, not just when it was being held by Ukraine and they were trying to repel the Wagner assault. How important is it? Should Ukraine continue to hold or withdraw to a more advantageous position to the western edge of the city? And then when in May-June timeframe, when Ukraine started kind of counterattacking that area, there's another question of what's the goal here? I would say a politically important city, just given the press that it's gotten over the course of the last year. I don't know in terms of its strategic value. I think that might be exclusive to tying up Russian resources. Kaufman and Lee get to that a little bit in the article here, but the idea as like a fixing operation, keep Russia having to pour troops in to defend Bakhmut because they don't want to lose that area. But it really doesn't look like an area where any sort of significant breakthrough can happen. When you look at older maps, some of the more significant Russian defensive positions from the 2014 war are not that far behind Bakhmut. So it's hard to imagine. And again, a lot of the fighting in the Bakhmut area, there are tanks and armored personnel carriers, but it does look like the majority of the Western equipment, majority of the fully outfitted armored brigades are in the south. So there would have to be some sort of swap with the units, bringing in additional units to see any sort of major success there. Getting into the sensitive topic of F-16s and Western aid that could or could not be sent in the near future. The authors say, observers have also argued that Ukraine would have achieved greater success if it had received F-16 fighters. Western aircraft would undoubtedly have helped Ukraine during this offensive if Ukrainian pilots had started training on these aircraft early in the war. Even if that happened, they might not have proven decisive because of Russia's extensive air defenses and tactical aviation. F-16 fighters will eventually help Ukraine contest the airspace, but having Western aircraft does not automatically convey the ability to attain air superiority. I think these guys have been hammering that point for quite a while, and I don't think it's really caught on. I think there's still this concept of if F-16s had gotten there a few months earlier, which it's just not, it doesn't matter now, right? It hasn't happened. I think I saw something recently that Ukraine is looking forward to implementing F-16s into their arsenal next summer, as in like they'll be ready to engage in combat in their skies next summer. Like it's just going to take a long time. But there's also this challenge where I think F-16 people automatically think, and well, here, the authors say it better than I can. They continue, what U.S. air power can achieve is not representative of a typical Western Air Force because of the extensive U.S. investments that have been made in enablers, supporting capabilities, organizational capacity, and experience in integrating air-land operations. Those effects are not likely to come from F-16s alone, and their performance also depends on the missiles and additional systems provided. It's a system. It's a new system for Ukraine, should increase, the capabilities in their Air Force, but it's the air war is a very complex problem in this war, for sure. The air denial going on over the battlefield, it's insane. There really hasn't been any sort of contested airspace like this in a war in a long, long time. So, the idea that this one platform can come in and somehow change that, like, not in the short term, maybe long term. But again, now we're not talking about how this could have affected this recent counteroffensive. We're talking about what the next few years look like in this conflict. The authors continue, what the past 18 months of fighting illustrates is that Western nations need to develop a long-term plan to sustain and improve Ukraine's war effort instead of pinning hopes on the next capability that will be introduced on the battlefield. For example, the Army Tactical Missile System, ATACMS, would be a useful addition to Ukraine's arsenal and should be provided, but there needs to be a more holistic approach to increasing Ukrainian capabilities. Often is more about the basics, more Humvees, more armored personnel carriers, more light mobility, night vision, and mine-clearing equipment could have more impact in aggregate than any one individual weapon system. And I feel like that's been a big thing, right? The top items. What are the things that always hit the news when we're talking about new systems going to Ukraine? Nobody's holding a press conference to say we're sending an additional 200 sets of night vision goggles to Ukraine, or it didn't make the news when we said we're going to send 400 Humvees or whatever number it is. I think it's a lot more than that. But the minute one of these big systems come into play, we're going to send Abrams. My God, that was all the news coverage, right? F-16s, no F-16s, maybe this country, and then the training will be over here. That's got news coverage for a couple months. We're still talking about ATACMS and how that's going to be this major thing that's going to drastically impact the outcome of the war. But the Storm Shadow is pretty similar in a lot of ways, right? Like all of a sudden, Ukraine has that capability to reach those targets at distance. It's the boring stuff, quite frankly. It's ramping up artillery production. They hit on that, how Europe really needs to pick up some of their munitions production capabilities if NATO, the United States, and the West wants to keep Ukraine in this fight and provide them the capability to win. It's not going to be whether or not Abrams enter the battlefield. It's going to be kind of the boring stuff: ammunition, armored mobility vehicles, maybe more drones. That might be an area that we could potentially help with going forward. But wrapping up, the authors say, independent of the outcome of this offensive, Western countries need to be clear-eyed about the fact that this will be a long war. Taken together, Western industrial and military potential greatly exceeds Russia's, but without the political will, potential alone will not translate into results. I think that's a great point to end on here. We, in a lot of ways, you're talking about this war being fought between Russia and the greater West, the manufacturing, the industrial capability of the West, but that's not really how it's been so far, right? Like Russia is ramping up in every way possible and navigating however they can through some of these sanctions, but that effort hasn't really been matched outside of Ukraine. Like, there have been some new initiatives to produce more weaponry in the United States and in some European nations, but not at the same scale that Russia has. So it'll be an interesting piece going forward. And I think part of that is that we've kind of pitched this war as, short and sweet. And I think that's one of the reasons that these game-changing weapon systems get so much attention. People think, well, if we just send over HIMARS, that could end this thing tomorrow. Or if we just send F-16s, that could be the end of it. But the reality is this is looking like the longer this war goes on, the longer it looks like it's going to continue. It's hard to imagine a scenario right now where this thing wraps up in 2023 or 2024. So it's not just a matter of the capability, which is there. It's the political and national will to actually make those decisions and push some of this stuff forward. But that's all I got for now. Again, this article is linked in the description if you want to read it in its entirety, as well as links to where you can find the authors of the article, Michael Kaufman and Rob Lee. Thanks for watching. We'll see y'all next time.